welcome to this lecture series by Temate on critical planning studies. And I'm Timos Karpouzoglu, an associate professor here at the Department of Thematic Studies, Technology and Social Change. And we are very happy today to have Mary Lawhon with us, who is a professor of political ecology at the University of Edinburgh. And the title of her talk today will be Theorising Beyond Modernity, a Modest Approach to Infrastructure and Cities. And the work of Mary in the area of political ecology is broad and extensive, and has also touched on other questions that we are particularly interested here at Temate regarding the role of technology and the politics associated with technology in cities. And she has been also developing very exciting work using the concept of heterogeneous infrastructure configuration, a concept that she has coined together with co-authors in an urban studies paper that came a little while ago, but not that long ago. And as far as I know, it also got the Urban Studies Best Article paper, Best Article Award, not so long ago either. Beyond her work with heterogeneity and infrastructure configurations, she's also been drawing on infrastructure, or let's say using infrastructure as a kind of entry point to ask critical questions about the role, for instance, of politics, the politics of knowledge, the sort of framings of sustainability, particularly in cities and in the global south, and what a good urban future might mean for different groups of people. And so one of Mary's current major interests, and which we are looking forward to listen more about also today, is the role of imagination, and also linking to that a concept that we've also been discussing called modest imaginary. As a way of understanding the world beyond the sort of modern Arcadian binary and an approach to building a better world amidst uncertainty, social and ecological. And she has also written an excellent book, co-authored with Tyler McCrary, titled Enough, a Modest Political Ecology for an Uncertain Future, where some of these questions are also discussed in detail. With that said, and with some small glitches with the microphone to start with, I hope you will enjoy this lecture. And those that are here in the room, please stick around for some light snacks and refreshments, and we will also have a chance to have further dialogues with Mary. So with that said, yes, Mary, welcome.
I've unmuted, and so I hope that is, can you all hear online? I'm going to take that as a maybe. Well, interrupt me if not. So thank you for the invitation and the welcome, Timos. I don't have the actual word technology here in the presentation, but I do think as I was trying to kind of come to understand where Timos, who I've known for longer, probably longer than you all have, what it is that you all are interested in, how to think with you for a little while today about what I'm interested in. It sounds like there's a lot of overlap where there's these objects that we're interested in, but we're not just interested in the objects. We're interested in what they tell us about the world, about people, about politics, about power. I move a lot, so hang on. Again, this is a kind of a funny device here, and we'll see how it goes. If it goes flying in just a minute. It's not meant to have glasses. Sorry, it's fallen off. There we go. Speaking of technology and people, I might even need to do this with that. Hang on. Let's try that. Glasses on top. Okay. I was saying this bit is very familiar to me, but we have a little clip thing that I'm more used to. So we're interested in technology and what it tells us. And there's a kind of a saying that a colleague of mine often says, he studies water, and he says he's not really interested in the water, he's interested in what the water tells him. I understand where he's coming from, but I'm one of those people who's also interested in this stuff, right? So I'm interested in what the stuff tells us, but I'm also interested in this stuff itself. And I say that as a little bit of preface for I talk a lot about toilets. And my kids who are almost 9 and 11 are like, laugh and think that's very funny, but also sort of gross and sort of not funny. So bear with me. For those of you who are interested in toilets, you're going to hear plenty about them. But also for those of you who are not interested in toilets, what I think the way that we in the world are thinking about toilets resonates with a lot of bigger questions. They're bigger questions that are social questions, but they're also questions about other kinds of infrastructure. So if you're interested in electricity, if you're interested in water, I think many of the most interesting places are where is what's happening with sanitation happening in other sectors of infrastructure. So as you all listen and think, of course, whatever questions you're welcome to ask, but some questions for us to think about around, does this resonate with other fields? Very happy to talk and think with you through that. So I know this is my very first slide, is to say this title slide, the first time I put the title slide together, even I was a little bit like, that's a bit much, right? That's a bit much. Theorizing beyond modernity, I haven't published with that phrase, but you know, when you're trying to get people to be interested in your work and come to a talk, you're like, let's go big and bold. But also I put the word modest in there. So on the very first slide, to acknowledge, these are not modest words. This is a big pitch. And I'm from small town America, where I grew up and still sit with a professor title and full-on imposter syndrome. I'm very aware of some tensions in proposing these ideas that are, in one sense, kind of big and bold. But it's a big and bold idea, and I want to say this carefully at the beginning and then again at the end. It's a big and bold idea to say we shouldn't think so big and bold. We should think really differently, right? It's absolutely a pitch to think very differently. But the underpinning idea here is, what kind of world do we build if we're modest? What kind of world do we build if we assume we can't hold our heads still enough to talk? Maybe I'll just, can I swap? Sorry, I thought I could just push power there. Maybe that's easier. I even had a headband. I was like, I can lose the headband. I don't think I could lose the glasses. That's probably a bridge too far. Yeah. Okay. Nope. Hello? So, yeah, we're good? Okay. All right. Well, technology and people is our theme for talking today. And I'm going to go with being modest enough to admit it when you are making mistakes and throwing things all over the place. So we'll try this way. Okay, what I was trying to pitch was, this is a story about how do we build the world if we start from a modest perspective about what we can know, about what we can know about nature, about what we can know about each other. So in some ways, it's quite different from how we understand things. But I suspect as we go, a lot of it is also familiar to those of you in the room thinking about technology and change. Okay, so again, big, bold proposal. I know it. I hear it. Let's start somewhere familiar. I imagine those of you who do infrastructure work and maybe even beyond that are familiar with this modern infrastructure ideal phrase. Yeah. So two geographers, I'm a geographer by training, wrote this book more than 20 years ago now, 25 years ago now, called Splintering Urbanism. Was a moment for really centering technology in the city, centering the question of infrastructure. They wrote at a time where privatization was really the dominant political conversation. They were really worried that the existing modern infrastructure was going to get split up and privatized into these smaller, more competitive pieces. Their political agenda is not as central in the book, but it's clearly underpinning the reason why they wrote the book, which is we should fight to get the modern infrastructure back again. The modern infrastructure is good. The problem is big private companies. And what we should do is not lose this great thing we already have. Happy to talk more about that, but I'm going to assume that's some familiar ground.
writing a little bit later, some scholars said if you're looking at global south cities, this modern infrastructure ideal isn't a good starting point because most of the city isn't on these grids. Most of the city was never networked in the same kind of way. And when we focus on that, what we focus on is the absence of modern infrastructure. And it's a story of global south problems, global south deficits. And instead, they argued we should focus on what infrastructure people already do have. They already have informal infrastructure. And we should explain this thing that most people use to get infrastructure with. The politics of this was more complicated, right? Graham and Marvin said, get the modern infrastructure back. These folks said, study the other stuff and oppose demolition of it most of the time. If there was a case where it had been demolished, there was an opposition to that. But what's the thing to do as a result of this? It is often unclear. And I want to recognize people interested in Global South stuff as authors from the Global North writing. Yes, I can understand not wanting to say what the answer is and some hesitance in the context of development studies to say what the answer should be. So for a lot of years, infrastructure conversations were kind of stuck here. There's modern infrastructure, it's great, we should get it back again. There's southern infrastructure that's often informal, we should pay attention to it, but then what? Then what? That's roughly where I came into the conversation in roughly 2015-16, trying to think about, well, what are the politics of this? And that's kind of the origins of this earlier project, which is how I met Timos and that 2018 paper that he mentioned. And what we kind of started to realize the more we dug into toilets, quite metaphorically in that sentence, the more we realized that the existing scholarship, the existing vocabulary, didn't explain everything, right? It focused on some parts of infrastructure, but not what I thought was the most interesting stuff. The most interesting kinds of toilets going on in the Global South are neither informal, nor are they modern. They're not connected to the grid, but they're not pit latrines. They're not composting toilets in a kind of the thing you might use if you go camping sort of way. And so what we, over a couple of different projects, including this most recent one, started to think about is, well, what happens if we pay attention to this thing that's different? What do we learn about infrastructure from toilets that don't fit our existing social science vocabulary? What we found is a lot of people trying to develop a different kind of toilet. And also, here's the foreshadowing, and also a very different kind of politics and a very different city as a result of that. Just to flag here, this is far from uncontroversial. The case that I have focused on in the most recent times is in Durban at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. They've got a long funded project working with Gates Foundation and others in the city. I also spent a lot of time in Kampala, so those are the two cases you'll hear the most about. But to reiterate, it's not a data-heavy presentation. I'm happy to talk about the data, but I think the thing that's most interesting for you all is not about the toilets, but what are the patterns that we're seeing? What are the different ways of doing things that are happening around these toilets? So this Durban case has been trashed by classic lefty Marxists who say, just like splintering urbanism, anything but the modern ideal is racist. Anything but the modern ideal is not good enough. What we should do is lean into the modern ideal and network the whole city. We'll circle back around to that critique, but let's acknowledge that critique and also still ask the question, right? What do we learn about the world from these alternative toilets? So I'll flag here the kind of theory process, but not deep dive into this. There's a different version of the talk where I could focus on what does it mean to do theory from the Global South, and this sort of intellectual, if I have two streams, one is the infrastructure and one is how do we theorize. So I'll flag this in just one slide, which is to say, of course, we've noticed the toilets are different. What do we do about that? Right? What do we do about that? How do we theorize from that? But how do we not just theorize from that? How do we do something different in the world because of and in relation to these theories. So there was a big conversation going on in urban studies around what does it mean to think from the global south. And part of the agenda for me, and you'll see why this matters for infrastructure, is we have to think of theory as more than just explaining in order to understand why people are so invested in theory. Theory tells us not just how the world is, but often there's this really quick jump between an explanation and a judgment, between an explanation of what is and a judgment of what should be, right? And we saw it with splintering urbanism. It was an analysis of what happened and a judgment of what should be. We see it with a lot of other literatures in post-development. There's a description of what is or what isn't, and then a judgment of what should be. And so we want to think about that for infrastructure, right? We've said there's this thing we haven't studied yet and we should study it, but we should also pay attention to what does that mean we should do? So we've tried to separate that, in a longer set of processes to not just say theory making, but theory, explain, and also what does that mean for what should be done, and tracing that out a little bit more slowly. Okay. And in doing that slower process, it helps us to clarify what I think Graham and Marvin jumped past a little bit too quickly, right? They said the goal is modern infrastructure ideal. And we tried to say, we understand why you think that, but actually that's not the goal. That's literally the means to the goal. It is a means to the goal, but not actually the only means to the goal. The technology isn't the goal. The technology is how we get the goal. And there's other ways of arranging the technology that might get us to the goal, and it might even get us better, get us to the goal better. So we've tried to say, okay, if the goal is actually safe, dignified, sustainable infrastructure, maybe there's other ways of doing infrastructure that are not the modern infrastructure ideal that do that better. Okay. So to do that, we had to look at their words, look at their theory. It's not a very theory-heavy book. That's not a criticism, it's an observation. Some books are more theory, and that's just fine. In conversation with Graham and Marvin in real life, I asked them, why did you call it the modern infrastructure ideal? Because after we'd written this kind of comment and critique a couple of times, it was like, we were in a workshop and someone else actually asked the question, well, why did you call it that? And they went, it just kind of seemed like the right word. And we didn't mean it to carry all of this theory baggage. And I kind of replied, I think it's actually the perfect word. Whether you really meant it to carry all this weight or not, it actually is the perfect word for what you're talking about. And the physical infrastructure carries with it all of these really powerful ideas of modernity, all of these really powerful ideas about knowing nature and controlling nature and having a uniform population that all uses the same infrastructure. So some of the earlier work is about just tracing out what is so modern about the thing they called the modern infrastructure ideal and linking it to these really broad fields. I think that's the next slide. Yeah, linking it to these really broad fields of academic study where modernity and what it is and what it means has been the subject of analysis. So we traced it out for infrastructure and said the modern infrastructure ideal, again, this is reading past Graham and Marvin, but I don't think it's against anything that they've said. What are the criteria or what are the characteristics of modern infrastructure? But in linking it to modernity, then we're linking it to this broader way of understanding the world, okay? You could call it positivist. I think that that's sort of true. It's got a lot of resonances with that, but that modernity has also some connotations that positivist doesn't have. We could talk more about that, but it's the words and the theory and that those things are interesting. But I think, again, for us to not get lost up here, but continue to bring it back down to the toilets. So development studies, environmental studies in the 90s were really interested in modernity. Nobody ever really resolved the question about modernity. We talked about it a lot, and then we sort of went, I think we've seen the end of that conversation and set it aside. So I and colleagues went back to those older conversations and went, well, maybe there's a next step. right? We sort of left the question of modernity in many fields for about 20 years. And we went, let's open that back up again. Let's open up that question of modernity again and ask, is there something else? Because the kind of classic way that is still there in environmental studies, it's still there in development studies, is to say there's modernity and tradition. There's modernity and what some would call post-development. There's modern in the environmental literature, the inverse is called arcadia. So you have these couple of different discipline-based or problem-based inverses, but most of the 1990s conversations were there's modernity and then there's the opposite. And then most people, my students in particular, would read this stuff and go, man, both of those suck, right? We don't like either one of those. They're both so extreme. What's option 3? And I would say, I don't know. There's no word for option 3. And I was so confident that if I did my lit review well enough, I would find someone else's word. And then imposter syndrome kicked in and you go, keep looking because somebody else has to have this word. And so I skip past this slide, which is, I suspect I don't need to convince you all, Arcadia, not that compelling. So we have a word that we're proposing as an option 3. And again, I realize that's a big thing to do. I'm not invested in the word modest. I can explain to you why. It's so interesting to talk about it in different countries because the cultural connotation of modest really varies across different places. I was in the Netherlands and they're like, modest is great. And then I was in the US and they're like, that's a terrible word. You can't sell that word. So we'll see. I have my intuitions and we'll see how well, whether you think modest is like a good aspiration or not. But I say that in the spirit of, even if we use a different word, the word isn't the point, right? To coin a new phrase isn't the point. To say there's a third option out there, and most of us know that in our hearts and most of us know that in our heads, but we don't name it and we don't talk about it. And what I'm going to pitch is that by naming it and talking about it, it gives us a much clearer vision of the world and the toilets. And maybe energy infrastructure, and maybe some other things that you're interested in too. So the pitch here is, okay, high theory, couldn't find a word, social science let me down. Let's try toilets instead. And we went, well, okay. Is there another kind of toilet that's not modern toilet and not a kind of Arcadian, I put my iconic image there, of a sort of like composting toilet. And again, we could talk about postmodern. I only put those bottom 2 toilets there for a little laugh in the middle of the presentation, because it turns out if you Google postmodern toilets, that's what you get. Not the most helpful way of thinking for us to make sense of actual material technological objects. So we could talk about it, but I don't think it's the word that helps us. It's the only other word. If you're going, there's modern, there's Arcadian. Some people say postmodern is a third. Doesn't help us with toilets. So again, we went to the places where we saw toilets that didn't fit the social theory. And we said, the real world doesn't operate in a modern Arcadian binary. Let's look at these toilets and try to understand the ideas people have that make them choose these toilets, that shape their choice of these toilets. So here's the pitch. What can we learn about how people understand the world, if you're way up here? Or what can we learn if you're kind of here? What can we learn about better infrastructure? Or if you're very specific, what can we learn about toilets? What can we learn from this infrastructure that is neither modern nor the opposite of modern? And now I'll tell you a little bit more about toilets. Okay. And what we found, me and a whole bunch of people who are thanked at the end, but to reiterate, a very collective project with a lot of people whose work and time has gone into this, not limited to, but including Timos here. Most of my work has been in African cities, but I'll show you a little bit later how it's resonated or struggled in other places. The pitch here is not that somebody's sitting there in an office going, I have a modest imaginary, I'm going to design a toilet, but instead to kind of do this teasing out from what they said, pushing them to articulate things that may not have been at the front of their mind. But we're finding a lot more similarity than I had expected to find in terms of how people understand the world today across North and South in many cases. The first piece is, again, it's this 2018 piece where we pitched heterogeneous infrastructure configurations, which is a strong contrast to the modern ideal, where the modern ideal is all the technology is the same. What we're seeing is that it's a diversity of technologies, many different toilet designs in one city happening all at once. And it's not a survival of the fittest story. Sure, some entrepreneurs want their design to win and cover the whole city, but most people seem to think the future is one of technological heterogeneity. If you're going to map that onto energy, it's a really straightforward, if not already answered in energy studies, that, you know, when I was growing up in the 80s, paying attention to environmental issues in the 90s, there was this sort of what energy source will be the future. We don't talk about it like that anymore, right? We say a mix. What's the energy mix? It's almost common sense at this stage. Similarly, what's the toilet mix? Definitely not the obvious way that everyone is talking about, but a push towards understanding it as a future of heterogeneity. I won't deep dive into the configurations part now, but what we're pitching is that analytically, we need to understand not the toilet, but how the toilet sits in other places. The reason why heterogeneity is often good is because if one toilet breaks, another one might work. If this toilet is susceptible to flood, this one might be susceptible to heat, but if there's a flood, this one won't be working. I don't remember which hand was which, but you understand the spirit of that. Different vulnerabilities means that when a crisis happens, some of the toilets are still working. If your toilet is in your private house and nobody else uses it, it's different than if these are public toilets or communal toilets or toilets or in a community where people are used to sharing. Okay. Another kind of feature that we talk about of this modest imaginary is there isn't an end game in someone's mind they are trying to achieve. Just really different than how much infrastructure works, right? Much infrastructure, there was a plan and we put the plan into place and we build it and we might grow that infrastructure, but it's, and I don't mean to overstate and oversimplify what the engineers do, but it's extend the sewer, right? What the future vision of this is emergent, but it's important for me politically to differentiate this from a traditional story, an Arcadian story, where the goal is to go backwards. Or where the idea is that there's a stasis, right? Once we have our community communing with nature, then that's the end. And a sort of rejection of the narrative of progress. We say in a modest imaginary, absolutely, there are still ways to improve things, and the way to improve things is not backwards, it's forwards, but it's not a sort of modernist thing where we know the direction and we've got the goal in mind. Okay. We talk about modest science, which I think is much of the sort of foundation for what Timos and I have been trying to make sense of, is that this idea that the world is knowable and controllable, right? Again, this resonates with many, many different sort of science and technology approaches here. We're not arguing that this is stuff no one else has ever mentioned. It's that we're trying to draw across many different fields here to say there's actually a similar thing underlying many of these features. Okay. Different kinds of knowledge. As I said at the very beginning, it's starting with uncertainty. It's starting with the idea that we cannot know and control the way that modernity is based on. And if we can't know and control the way modernity is based on, then modernity doesn't work. It falls apart. We also talk about how this changes the role of the state. What the state does in the modern infrastructure ideal is very straightforward. What the state does in Arcadia is not exist. We think that there's a reason and a role for a state to exist, but that we need to re-articulate that role, right? What does the state do? It governs. Yeah.
Let's say what you mean by Arcadia.
Yeah. No worries. Great. I skipped fast. Modernity, one side of this. I'll do this slide. In development studies, the opposite of modernity is tradition. In environmental studies, the opposite of modernity is called arcadia. In development studies, you also have a lot of post-development stuff. And so what we try to do, we do this longer in the book enough for a kind of more rigorous defense of this. What we try to do is say there's not a single umbrella term for things that are the opposite of modernity, but they exist largely across development studies and environmental studies, and we just chose one to be the umbrella term. It could also be tradition, but that word is so problematic that we intentionally don't. And I don't choose the word post-development because actually not all post-development is Arcadian. It kind of spills over. And I could say the opposite of modern each time, but that's a mouthful. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. And so again, the iconic one is that composting toilet will live in harmony with nature. We will have a horizontal community of people who all get along. And we find echoes of that in environmental studies in post-development. There's our toilet. Okay. So I would say a kind of, if modernity is about knowing and controlling nature, arcadia is about living communally with nature. It is a very anti-technological perspective. Okay, here we were on governance, right? So yeah, in a kind of post-development Arcadian world, there is no role of government, right? It's the sort of falling away of the state that Marx predicted would happen in a fully communal society. I'm going to spend a couple of slides on what does this mean for the sort of urban metabolism. And I think it's an interesting place to start to kind of land some of these differences, where we've got this sort of, I've now laid out modern, Arcadian, this other thing called modest. We've talked a little bit about some criteria of modest. And I want to talk about why it's kind of hard for us to quite draw lines around these things and some of the messiness that goes with some of the modest vocabulary. So to reiterate, it's not that we found one pure example of a modest toilet and now we can theorize from it. What we found is stuff that's like, it's got a little bit of modest, it's got a little bit of modern, it's sometimes got a little bit of Arcadian thrown into it. And so to articulate a little bit of that messiness using the criteria of urban metabolism as a place to dig a little bit more. Classic Arcadia, there's no such thing as cities. Cities are bad and terrible, we shouldn't have them. Classic modern, we have this linear version of a city where good stuff comes in and bad stuff goes up. Environmentalists have pitched, we should have a circular city, we should have a circular economy, and that's how we are going to get something more sustainable. And the way that many folks have done that is only a sort of minor tweak of the modern urban metabolism. And it's to say, well, let's just take that city scale and circle it. And so you might have like gray water recycling of one big factory at the urban edge, right? So we don't need to change the pipes. We don't need to change the sewers. All we need to do is instead of having bad stuff go out, we make the bad stuff clean and then it goes back in again. Good thing I got a mic because we'd have definitely lost the headset there if we still had it, okay? So you can imagine, I imagine that here in Sweden, there are certainly people pitching that that's how we should do the circular economy. That's how we should get sustainable water. We had an example that kind of made us scratch our heads in Kampala. Again, here we go back to the toilets, where they had pit latrines, some of them more safe than others. There was the introduction of this thing called the gulper. It really is a guy on a motorcycle with barrels of poop, and he's got a machine that sucks it out. And we went, is this modest or not? And our first thought was, okay, it's definitely part of a heterogeneous infrastructure configuration where we have these alternative technologies working together. But what we found is that the push was for these guys to actually mimic the modern infrastructure. So instead of having a pipe, a sewer that would take the poo out, they would have a guy on a motorcycle take the poo out to the city edge, right? So there are some versions where we have this alternative technology mimicking modernity. But there were some people who thought same technology, different metabolism. Some people thought what this guy should do is suck the poo out, take it somewhere local, compost it, grow vegetables. Both of those are circles, right? Both of those are the same technology, but they're different scales of operation. They're different urban metabolisms. And so I raise this one not to resolve it, so much as to sort of point to the imperfections of where we are, the uncertainties of where we are, where we're thinking, what are the good technologies? What are the good flows? What are the good spatialities here? Certainly the worry was that if you have these guys mimicking modernity, first of all, what they do is not actually do it. Many of them just dump the waste on the side of the road or in the river and it washes it away. And away doesn't exist. If those guys were sucking up the poop and they were having to manage it in a more local way, it's not away. And the kind of emotional and informal regulation that does exist would not allow the same kinds of away things to happen. And so there's a full talk one could do around the metabolism and the sort of social and political trade-offs of these smaller, maybe not small, but smaller than an urban scale metabolism. Okay. And so what we're trying to think through is the difference between these different ways of handling that fecal sludge in different locations through different technologies, right? So there's also an example from Nairobi where there's a biodigester, different technology. They're not sucking it out with a vacuum and driving it away. They're digesting it. Well, they aren't. It is digesting itself on site, and then they get gas from it. And then in theory, they can put it in the farm and crops can grow, and it is fairly localized. It's not a circle. It's a squiggle. And we think that that's a little bit silly, but it's part of our pitch here, right? Circles are beautiful, neat, modernist shapes, right? Isn't it lovely to imagine, as beautifully elegant as this is, circular city stuff is always literally a circle. And we're like, okay, again, I approve of the aesthetic elegance, but the world doesn't work that way. Much as I wish sometimes that it did, the world doesn't work in circles, it works in squiggles. And so it's a little bit of a silly geometry difference, but it's also a really different way of thinking about it. Look, we're going to have a squiggly pattern here, and maybe that's the best we can do. Maybe it's progress, not perfect circles. To do this, of course, this is not to say this is the perfect biodigester. Everybody should do it like this. They have yet to find anyone who wants their poo fertilizer. It's expensive to take it to the urban edge. Land is hard to access, and so there's not a lot of gardening going on. You could think about ways where the role of the state could be to subsidize. You could think about ways where the role of the state is to ensure that there is a different density that enables more gardening. The point here is not we've found the modest answer, but it is to say all of the examples have more questions to ask and think about. End of poop. On to other things. The pitch here is, so we're going, we had big broad stuff setting us up, some stuff about the toilets. Now we're going to go back out again to say, what's the point of what I've been talking about? The pitch is that this is definitely true for toilets, but it's not just true for toilets. And this was the pitch that we made for the project that I worked on with Timos, which is, as different as flooding and sanitation are, we can find, if we look for it, not dissimilar trends around how some people, there's a lot of sums in there, some people are thinking about how to manage floods. Totally different case, but thinking about managing floods, not through big modernist infrastructure, right? Modernist infrastructure, concrete, control the water, send it out. Arcadian, let's just let nature do her thing and wetlands will fix the problem for us. But instead thinking about these mobile intermediary technologies that can move around the city. We might not know where the flood's going to happen, but we can do some good guessing and also build systems for quick responses. They're smaller tech. They're still advanced tech, right? It's not just sandbags, although sandbags can be a part of a story here. I shared this one because I had nothing to do with this work. I was in Cape Town actually a couple of years before, so I know some of these folks, but the way that they are thinking is very similar with this piece. They ask the question, what's the sustainable energy future? Is it renewables connected to a modern grid? Which would basically be my version of the guy on the motorcycle copying the modern with a slightly different technology. Similarly, you can try to make renewables into a modern infrastructure. You can try, people are trying awfully hard, sometimes with more and less success, but then they position this other alternative, which they really focus on questions of social control, political power. What would it change to do energy at a different scale with different people controlling it, not all on one grid? Okay, so we've been trying, this has been a multi-year work in progress table, which we are happy to have questions and feedback as we someday will surely publish it, but haven't yet because we're like, it's not there yet, but it's also a collective project. And so we need to work with each other to get this out in a moment where we all get credit for it. But we're trying to spell out, okay, you can imagine an Arcadian version here, which we didn't bother with because it's so like, Arcadian isn't really about infrastructure and technology so much as go to the river with your clay bucket. I sound a little dismissive of that. I'm happy to be more nuanced if that's helpful to be more nuanced. So we're trying to articulate some of those key characteristics there. But it's also not just about infrastructure and it's not just about cities, right? It's that this is politically different. And one of the directions that I'm interested in taking this work forward is really thinking about how control is different in these different systems, right? If you have a good modernist state, modernist infrastructure works very well for you. If you are in any way not fitting the kind of norm of the state or your state is not a great state, then maybe these other alternatives give you more control over what it is that you're doing, give you more control over your local resources. The one in Nairobi I showed you the picture of, the guys called it, this is our infrastructure of the future, and we want to have this because it's the first time we've really controlled something. We control our energy, we control our poop, we have a greater influence over the quality of our water if this was a thing that everyone else did. At the minute, everybody else's poo is still getting washed back to them, so it doesn't fix everything. But it's a level of not full autonomy, but more autonomy. Okay. Also shapes our understanding again of what a city is, what an urban metabolism is. I'm going to skip this because now we'll go real quick. So again, you remember when we were saying what's the point of theorizing? It's just this reminder. Yes, absolutely. I think our job in the academy is to explain stuff, for sure. Explain this alternative technology, but also to ask the political question, right? Is this better infrastructure? On what criteria does this stuff work better? And maybe not to say you should do this. I think for me that's a bridge too far. But it is to make sure we're attending to the political question, that we're asking the political question, that we're working with stakeholders to ask them, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? What would change if we did it that way? The next kind of phase of work for me is digging more into the talking with political and entrepreneurs in South Africa, thinking about, is this a good change? Right? My opinion is I'm happy to give it, but also like, let's understand together what changes. Okay. The pitch here is not the opposite of modernity. Again, can't say that often enough. It's not to say flip modernity and give us the opposite. A lot of these technologies have long been positioned as temporary until we get the good stuff. the pitch here is not temporary until we get the good stuff. It's that this is potentially the good stuff. And again, I mentioned to you the sort of quick and easy comment that is anything but modern is racist. Again, the pitch here is that inequality and sameness aren't the same thing. That we might be able to grab a hold of heterogeneity and still have some version of equality in our differences, equality in our different toilets. When I review papers, sometimes I have to write that very strongly and because it has been a thing that has crossed my desk a few times with the peer review process of heterogeneity is unequal, to which one might say it could be, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes heterogeneity is unequal, but to dismiss it because sometimes it is unequal, I think is to jump too quickly to an answer instead of be in a position of we don't know, but it could be. So again, we've tried to articulate, and the book focuses more on this level, right? What's the imaginary? The kind of peer-reviewed publications are more about the infrastructure. The book is teasing out this imaginary. What's the way of understanding the world that lies behind doing these toilets differently? Unknowable and uncertain, and there's a but there, right? But we can still act. We can still do stuff. We can still shape the world. Ha 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 ha. I pose myself some questions, which you should feel free to know that I am wondering about them and ask questions of your own. But I flag this at the end to reinforce the pitch here is not, I have all the answers, here you go. It's to say, I think a lot of us, we'll see, your faces are, kind of thinking about it, which is great. The pitch here is not that I have it all and now we should just do this. It's to say, I think from having talked to folks in different countries and places, different kinds of toilets, but also different kinds of infrastructures, I think that there's a thing here that we are probably sharing. Some uncertainty around how to do things, but also a growing confidence with this pitch of uncertainty, but still a desire to act. Uncertainty, but still some optimism that we can make the world better. Pessimism about some technology, but optimism about some technology. So the pitch here is, I'm definitely trying to think onwards. Maybe feel free to think with us where some things resonate. To say, again, the first line there is just, yeah, there's tons of stuff this resonates. Our pitch is not, we're breaking new territory here. It's to say, we're teasing out the similarities across so many different literatures, because I think that's important for us to recognize and see and build together from that. Absolutely more work to do to say, remember the example with the motorcycle and the biodegradable, like the perfect toilet still isn't out there. Some folks have described this change as a more pragmatic thing. I think that word kind of misses some stuff. Like it's a useful starting word, I think. But I think there's something much deeper than pragmatism going on here. Yes, to recognize loud and clear the Gates Foundation funding of a lot of this work is something to be really cautious around. But just because Gates funded it shouldn't mean that we dismiss it out of hand as inherently flawed. Again, everything is a little bit impure here. And that's part of our pitch, is that it doesn't have to be a pure process in order for it to maybe have some good outcomes. Okay, again, is the shift good? What does it mean for progress? What does it mean for justice? Happy to think forwards, but I don't have final answers for that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep thinking and talking about it. So I put a couple of the papers, again, Timos here with the work in Kampala. There's a book chapter, again, if you're interested in any of it, happy to share stuff that you might not be able to access, but the book is, here's my advertising, it's open access. And a whole bunch of these are the more, like, if you want the details of the toilets, that's some of the details of the toilets. But to end with a big thanks. So many different people and projects and moments. This work has been kind of almost a snowball of ideas. And so to name a few of them here, mindful that I could fill the whole slide with explaining which ideas came from where, but instead to just recognize it's very much a collective effort. Some names on publications and some questions about what next. Thanks, guys. It has never happened that no one has questions. That's not a challenge.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary, for this really inspiring and thought-provocative presentation. I would like to maybe see if there are any questions already from the floor emerging. Harald?
Now we need the mic. Oh, sorry, maybe you can use this one or something so that you don't each time have to. Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. Great talk, really. I just, so one association I have, when you present this modest version, how does this, in your view, relate to this older discussion on intermediate technology, alternative technology movements, small scale, decentralized, also a form of modesty, also a form of kind of contrast to this large scale, mature modern infrastructures, what this modern infrastructure ideal relates to. Is this linking into this discourse also? Or?
Do you want me to just use the box? I can pass it around. All right, we'll try this way. The short version is absolutely a lot of resonance. My own careful, cautious sense was I think those folks stopped too soon. What we try to do is it's not quite pick up where they left off, because there are some differences where I wouldn't say small is beautiful, for example. Maybe it's too easy to say medium because everything is in the middle, but I think we're not saying that inherently small. Like, I think small pushes us towards that Arcadian in a way that I'm not excited to go that far. But I think that there's a lot of sort of social theory questions that didn't get answered in that literature. It was often about the technology, and there were these hints of, well, decentralized enables autonomy. But what we've tried to do is agree with that, but also then tie it into much bigger, longer debates around what is knowledge politics, around what's the role of the state, around how do we make sense of kind of the sort of anti-state, pro-state debates and push past them to say, what is the role? Right? So our stuff on the state is a much more active state than those technologies would have had, because part of why they failed was that the state didn't help them. The state didn't support them. The state didn't regulate them. And that's what they wanted. And so I think they then kind of fell off in the same way that a lot of Arcadian stuff falls away. But what we argue in short is we want to use the state not to give it power, but to use it to support this.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other points? I see a hand there. Yeah. You can also briefly introduce yourselves when you get the mic. That would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah, that works. Right. Nils Markussen, Lancaster University. So let's see if I understood this right. I might not have. What I think I heard was that you set up this sort of binary to start with, right? Modernism versus the Arcadian, and this is somehow in between. But then I think you veered towards contrasting the squiggles with modernity much more than with the Arcadian ideal. So could you articulate that distinction in a couple of sentences, please? And then an even sillier question, I think. I know very little about Africa, so this might be probably stupid. But so where is capitalism happening? I mean, it has happened in China for a good while. It's probably happening in India to a fair extent. Why should I care about Kampala? To be really clumsy about it.
Yeah, so thanks for the questions. In a couple sentences is a good one, because I struggle with short. I think that the squiggles are probably the right metaphor for okay, I'm gonna slightly longer. The quick and easy way to think of this is something between. But what we pitch pretty hard in the book and in a few more pages than I'll do is that this is actually, it's better if you think about this as a thing that breaks the binary. Rather than saying modernity, arcadia is a spectrum, we're saying it's a binary and it's the wrong way to think about things. What we need is an alternative, not a middle ground. So in some ways it feels like the middle, but I think to answer your question, is to say what we need is something categorically different on a different axis. And so arcadia is also a lot of purism, a lot of circles, a lot of harmony, not a lot of friction, right? And so that's one where actually modern and arcadia are almost similar in their homogenization of people and their idea. This one, the idea that we'll like live naturally in harmony with nature, is kind of foundational. And we're saying no to the neat circles on both counts. Squiggles is messy, squiggles is complicated, squiggles is not knowable, it's not predictable. And that's where the kind of the playful geometry there is meant to say, it's to acknowledge maybe we don't like that, right? Emotionally, if I was given these three options, emotionally, I'm not sure this is what I would choose, is to say I think it's a more accurate representation of the world we have and the way it works. Where's capitalism? So it's definitely, again, to pitch it as in the book and give you the short answer, I think a lot of our debates get stuck in capitalism versus not capitalism. When I teach capitalism, I tell my students, for a little while, don't use that word, because what it means is a word that inflames our emotions more than our brains. Same with socialism. Most of us actually don't mean the same thing when we use those words. So let's talk about property. Let's talk about private property, common property, and state property. Let's talk about the structure of an enterprise. Is it privately owned or is it owned by shareholders? Those are incredibly different from each other, right? Let's talk about markets. How free are the markets? How much are we regulating the markets? And let's have a debate about those things, because many capitalists believe in regulation. Many capitalists also believe in state ownership of property, even though it doesn't match the canonical definition. And so I share that slightly long thing as a pitch to all of you teaching anyone, anywhere. I would absolutely recommend going that way, because then they find allies with people who they didn't realize they were allies with, and enemies of people they didn't realize they were enemies with, because those words meant I'm on this side, you're on that side. But most of us don't have that straightforward of a political thing. And so in doing that, in what we try to do is to open a space for something that is not canonical socialism and not canonical capitalism. A modest economy for us, there's a whole chapter in the book for details, is reducing the role of shareholder-owned, profit-focused corporations. Absolutely, the guys that Graham and Marvin were talking about are the bad guys. I agree, those are the bad guys. But I have worked mostly in places where the state is a bad guy too. I wouldn't want the state in Kampala to have more power than it has, and most citizens wouldn't either. Again, get in trouble for saying that, but I can say it's not everyone can say that. The idea that the state would ever give services to everyone under the state regimes that we have, it's not a realistic way to go. So the classic socialist narrative of a state strong, big, doesn't make sense. But equally, the kind of James C. Scott anarchist, we don't need the state, we'll do it without the state, doesn't work either. So we could either get stuck in that, or we could have an impure, imperfect version that says, and I follow the Eric Olin Wright strategy here of not the revolution, but reduce in every way we can the role of corporations. Anything that is driven by a for-profit legal entity, we want to take them out as best we can. But private ownership isn't inherently bad, I would say. And there's a big distinction between a farmer who owns his farm and a farmer who's owned by Monsanto, or a farm that is, they don't own the farms, but you know, that's the short version. And so in this infrastructure, there's a lot of privately owned infrastructure, but it's a guy and his buddies who listen when the mama tells them it's getting stinky. And they react in an incredibly different way than a corporation who will, like, they can't leave. They could leave, but they wouldn't leave, right? And so recognizing that there is underused vocabulary outside of those classic political economy ones to say we want more of this kind of enterprise. We want more regulation. We want subsidization of businesses we like. And it's okay to say that. That I think is where there's scope for stepping outside of this. And I think that actually works for us outside of toilets too. So when I talk to my students in the UK around these sorts of things, I don't tell them about the toilets, but I do tell them about, right, what's their different vocabulary for a political economy and what does that mean here? What does that mean for us in Scotland? What does that mean in different scales? And to open a space to think more creatively by breaking out of those very emotional words. That was more than a few sentences, but it was a really big question.
Thank you. And yeah, we have a question from Marcus.
Yes, I also try to keep some distance. Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm Marcus Moel and in-house here at the Department of Thematic Studies. Thank you so much for this lecture. A really interesting concept, this idea of modest. And I don't have actually much to say about its use as you presented here in terms of how it can be used to understand what infrastructures look like. It all seems very sound. But you were also talking about this as a political proposal, or as a kind of pathway for politics or something like that. And I first wanted to just, if you can say a little bit more about in what ways you have been using it for this and how you imagine that it can be used for this. I guess I can also read a book and maybe learn more about it. But I also wanted to ask if, I think it was the second table, where among other things, there was the comparison between the modern ideal representing the grand and then the modest ideal, do we call it that? I don't know, but represented the mundane. But in like, for instance, the eco-socialist tradition, there's also this notion of public luxury, right? So what I wanted to ask is, shouldn't some things be grand, right? I mean, like a university hospital, for instance, right? A terribly fascinating infrastructure, which is not only does it perform a super important function, which is very impressive, but it is also grand. And isn't that something to kind of keep and further, I guess? Whereas other things, of course, if we want to live on a livable planet, cannot be grand. So I wanted to ask about that. Thanks.
It's a great question. And it, you know, in a mental note, I feel like probably a whole slide to answer you is a good one to think about. The short first point is to say, this is an academic pitch that I've made to you, and I think of modest as an analytical word. I think it would be a terrible mistake to put modest on a placard and march with it. But the reason we titled the book Enough is I think that's actually the political word for me. Enough for all forever is over simple, but I think that's the pitch we're trying to get at here, is that that's the starting point. There's more than one way to get to enough. And so that's why we say we need the analytic part, which is to differentiate a modern approach to enough from a modest approach to enough, because we think the modern doesn't get us there. And the Arcadian version, again, doesn't really work. And so I think there are ways of trying to understand, use the state to ensure that everyone has enough without empowering the state. A toilet that is more work than the toilets most of us, I assume, use every day. It's more work. But that we would potentially give up some of the luxuries we have to do the more sustainable and just infrastructure pathway. That's a tough sell for us. It's not a tough sell in Nairobi, though, right? Where you don't think you're not giving up the modern toilet, you're giving up the dream of a modern toilet, which was probably not going to happen anyway. And so I do think that the cell is much easier in places where most people don't have enough, but it's still important to talk about it in places like this where we say, what would you gain from it? What autonomy would you gain from this, and why and under what circumstances might that be useful? Definitely the eco-socialist luxury is the framing we are framing against. Again, in the book more centrally than in the infrastructure writing, a part of me wishes that I believed them. And a big part of me is because I root my roots in a different context, but I think even in the context they're talking about, that version of eco-socialist luxury only exists if you maintain colonial relations with the rest of the world. And I think that they don't want to look hard at that material legacy. And then there's some of them that are like, if we center that material legacy, we'll never win in the global north. Yes, yeah. Matt and I studied at the same place, and so I drank beer with Matt before I read his work. Yes. So it's definitely, he is the kind of person that I wish sometimes I agreed with. You know, you're like, if only that world could be possible, but I think it's wishful thinking. And I think, again, off the record, I think he knows that, but the alternative is hard. And instead of choosing the hard alternative, it's choosing the easy. Like, who wouldn't love eco-socialist luxury for all? Well, sure. Gates and Musk don't like that, but the rest of us think that sounds great. It's whether or not that's actually a realistic ecological pathway. My background is environmental science. I'm not a hardcore scientist, but I think that shapes how you come at some of those questions around metabolism and energy deficits and those kinds of questions. And so I do think that there's some care. What I want is a much more carefulness with the language, because you say luxury and you set people up to expect things that I think are, again, tenable only in a context of neocolonial ongoing extraction. I do think the pitch we're making is radical. We use that word. It's a radically different way of understanding the world. I think it's materially better for almost everyone. But it takes a lot more than just a different toilet, right? We talk in the book about basic income as actually a really important part of a wider puzzle here, because if you're going to do more work on your toilet, you're going to need some help with that. And so taking a bunch of these different pieces and saying, actually, the literature on cash transfers never talks to the literature on infrastructure. That's okay. But actually, if you put these in conversation with each other, they're both more compelling. And here's the key. They're underpinned by this really different imaginary. Cash transfers also assume the state doesn't know best. But it also assumes the state should do something, which is the same thing as the kind of infrastructure stuff. Like, that's weird that we have this similar imaginary of the state for two radically different things that don't usually speak to each other. And so to maybe sum up again with a single sentence, I wish that the material possibilities were different, but I think of myself as an optimist to say I think enough for all is a pretty great ambition, and I actually think it's materially doable, but we should set our eyes on the hard possible rather than the implausible lovely.
Yeah, one question over there, and we have the.
Hey, thank you, Alanda Kamana. I'm based in Morocco. I'm in the Sixth Polytechnic University. I come from Rwanda. I'm currently doing research on East African cities, development, explore. And definitely, this is a very interesting approach to modernity, cities, infrastructure. And I have few comments, and I liked much on one moment you said inequality and sameness are the same. And there is a work that has been done by a Senegalese human geographer also called Feruinsal, where he was more or less also talking about infrastructure and the neocolonialism, and trying to explain how infrastructure and its modern approach, how everything has to be, and put it in a context after the Second World War that with the resources scarcity, and there was a need to uniformers to make everything uniform for practical reasons. And then in the African context, many people see that now that there is urban population growth, that is, we need a way of more or less producing the grid, the things, so that we can at least optimize the resources. I think there is a counter argument to that interesting approach that you are having, but also the question is, how do we go beyond? Because you are proposing another alternative, not modernist, and also not Arcadian, but an alternative. But how do we, from, I don't know if I got it well, it's like, it's a way of having local materiality or infrastructure, not trying to copy the modern or the way of going away from the neocolonialism. But also with the so many things that are happening in the cities, you talked about Kampala or Nairobi or South African cities, how do we operationalize that alternative? That's my question. How, like, I understand it and I see it, but I always see it on smaller scale, like what you say, whether it be energy, whether it be infrastructure, toilets, doing it on a smaller scale in the circularity, it's more feasible. But how do I scale it? When I scale it, I'm afraid that I may again come back where the alternative become again, could be in a vicious cycle. It will become again the norm. Then we'll go into the debate of modernity. I don't know if my question is clear or my comment.
Yeah, I have again many notes here, and I'll maybe just touch on the highlights to respond. To thank you for the comments, and I think it's always nice when the questions show that you understood and are really those next questions, right? And so this question that I hear from you of well, now what, right? Like, we've articulated it, and now what? And I think for me, one of those first things is quite simply to name it, because as I said a few minutes ago, it's really hard to build a mobilization around a thing where we're not even recognizing who our allies are. And so I think that one of the big contributions that I hope for with this, again, I wish someone else had did it and I could just cite them instead, because it feels awkward. And I will maybe someday give a presentation where I don't say that, but I think it's important to share, right? Like, feels awkward to say, here, use my term. Somebody else wants to pitch something else, go for it. The point is for us to recognize who we share these ideas with. Because I think one of the most difficult things about what happened with the post-development movement in the streets and in the scholarship was that it got positioned as the opposite of modernity, right? So if either you were for the modern vision or you were against progress, and you were against the state, and you were for composting toilets. And we didn't have another vocabulary to even imagine something else. And so it became very, again, in South Africa is where I was living, and part of why I started working somewhere else was because in South Africa, it was political suicide to say anything other than flushing toilet, little house, electricity on the grid, roads for all, cars for all. That was the story from 1994 for another 15 years, and no politician would say any differently. And why I became really interested in Durban, it was one of the first places I spent time but I wasn't interested in toilets then, because what 20-something-year-old really wants to think about toilets? And yet here I am, 20 years on, went, this is where there's a different thing happening. And by paying attention to that, we can understand why, amidst a country where everyone was saying flush toilets are the only way, they found a way to put state money, found Gates Foundation money, scientists, and spend 20 years trying to figure out what an alternative would be. It's still not perfect, but there's thousands of these alternatives being used. There's still an emergent governance framework. What's the role of the state is literally still a question, not a thing they have the answer to. But for me, when I choose a place to do research, I'm not looking for the typical. I'm on purpose looking for the places we can learn from to try to figure out, is there a good version of this, and what would that take, and how do we convince people, right? So short version, name it, find places that are doing it, learn from them, don't overclaim, and talk to each other about it. And I think all of that is more convincing now than it has ever been in our history for a number of reasons. One of which is absolutely the climate crisis stuff, right? I think that regular people in Kampala and Durban are more accepting of a non-European future now than ever, possibly ever, I don't know, hundreds of years ago maybe, but certainly in the last 50 to 100 years, people today go, actually, that might not happen. At least the ones that I would be really interested to hear if your sense is similar. 50 years ago, you couldn't say we're not going to all have flushing toilets in Kampala either. But today, nobody's saying flushing toilets for everyone. It's just unreasonable. And that opens, it's sad to close that door, but it's nice to open other doors. And I think there's a willingness to consider things now that is not for good reasons, but for real reasons. And maybe that's a moment to harness some possibilities and some optimism. And when we were writing this Enough book, it was a much more optimistic political moment. And in some moments, I feel like we sort of missed the mark in terms of the tenor of the book, because the book is like, look, we can make things different. It's hard, but we can. And now it's sort of, we're in a moment where I think a lot of people feel really pessimistic, and it makes our sort of slightly more hopeful story a little less resonant. But I do still think that there are ways of selling this that are so much of an improvement for so many people that as long as we don't oversell it and we build the political alliances and help people understand it's not a composting toilet, it's not a this, we're not saying go live in the rural areas and have subsistence farming. It's not easy. But I think it's better than all the other alternatives I've come across, which is not a great sales pitch, but that's the honest version.
So we have a question from the audience which is following us online.
Yeah, thanks. Michael Onetsila has a question. Michael, do you want, wait a second, do you want to ask it yourself? You should be live now.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. My question is about the term infrastructure, how you define it. So recently, this term has been used very loosely. So anything could be considered infrastructure. But infra is something under or combining things, bringing things together. What is your definition of infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I hear an implicit critique of how some people are using that term. And I would start off with agreeing. I think words only are useful if we use them clearly and consistently. To me, infrastructure is the stuff that moves other stuff, that enable, like, it's not good in and of itself. Its reason for existing is to get some stuff somewhere else. And so that's where I would sort of defend some of the more social takes on it, where sometimes people do physically move the water, but I would differentiate it in saying the reason that those humans exist is not to be water carriers. And so for me, the part of the reason we pitched heterogeneous infrastructure configurations was to insist that the pipes and wires aren't the interesting thing. And we shouldn't study them by themselves. We shouldn't study the kind of classic infrastructure by itself. We should always study it in relation to all the other pieces of it. Obviously, you have to draw a boundary somewhere, and it's not to say that we always need to trace everything out to the furthest edges. But I do think that understanding the people who work with the infrastructure as part of the configuration is important. The users as part of the configuration is important. And so rather than over-focus on that, I do think that the kinds of treating libraries as social infrastructure, I think it misunderstands what is helpful about that word. Use another word, right? It's not about being possessive, but it's about the analytical process you go through to understand a thing that moves things is different than the analytical process you use to understand a place that holds books. Maybe I'll stop there.
Many thanks. Interesting.
Yeah, maybe do we have another reflection from the audience online or here in the room? Otherwise, I would also maybe wanted to share one of my kind of reflections that was relating a little bit to in which ways can some of the ideas and also these concepts can be relatable in sort of global north context. So in the context, for instance, of Sweden, where we have been exploring a little bit some of these reasonings of actors that work closely with infrastructure, we find that maybe because I think one of the things you mentioned is the sort of like inequality and the sort of the permanent unequal sort of spatiality of infrastructure in places like Kampala. But perhaps here we see a kind of like a different momentum of questioning that is much more geared around climate. So sort of a certain questioning of the modern infrastructure ideal that doesn't come out of inequality, but out of a notion that modern infrastructure doesn't solve the climate. And what is interesting is that we hear that from actors that you could say are quite close to the modern infrastructure ideal. So I'm not saying it's like everyone, and I think that's where I really connect with your point about we don't know where alliances are, and I think that's one of the things we also with Liz we try to sort of tease out this idea of to what degree are structures within traditional infrastructure sectors able to change away from the modern infrastructure ideal. And so that I was just wondering there what you thought about climate emergency. And I mean, Sweden offers very interesting empirical insights on that, particularly in the context of water, because there's a very vibrant discussion now around how do we deal with floods. This model of infrastructure doesn't quite solve it for us. So I'm just wondering, does that create maybe a different conversation around the modest imaginary than the one we see like in Kampala?
So the short version is, you know better than I do, but I think it's part of why we've had some interesting conversations, and so I've been trying to think about it in the UK context as well. And I think that it's definitely climate as an instigator for saying we need to do things differently. Absolutely. I think to say loud and clear, I'm not a climate skepticist at all. I do think sometimes the using of it in a kind of Naomi Klein way, like using it to make people think about things that they otherwise wouldn't think about, to open boxes that were otherwise unopenable. It's not to go off on her and her CV, but you know, she's using the shock doctrine in a different sort of way and doing it themselves. And I think that it's not a bad tactic for all of us, right? To say, I think this would be true even if climate wasn't a factor, but climate can be an avenue for opening conversations about why the existing structures aren't working. And again, I think you all probably don't have many of those concrete flood things anymore, but they're also so iconic. Like how we will control floods is by building concrete things that make the water go the way we want it to go. And we've acknowledged that those just, they help sometimes some people protect some things. They don't fix the problem. I think the other piece that for me is also quite useful for the toilets is we're going to hit a soil crisis. It's not nearly as cool to talk about as hurricanes and but unless we do something to return some stuff to the soils, we're like in the UK, that the only way we can grow stuff is by importing. Again, it's the colonialism connections. We import from the global south all kinds of things that enable us to grow food. I would imagine that's true here. And so these ways of saying it's not a circle, it's a squiggle, but still that idea of we can fix actually multiple things together, not fix them perfectly, but address them by building back these connections again. I think that sort of thinking is part of this long story of environmental thinking of 70 years of saying we actually can fix multiple problems together because of all of these interrelationships. If climate pushes us to do that, great.
There is one more question from the audience listening online.
Yes, there's a question from Peter. Peter, do you want to ask it directly yourself?
No.
Peter, do you want to try or? Otherwise, I'll just ask it. So you have worked in different, and I think that the contexts are very different in different contexts. I think they should mean, and I think that the contexts are very different among those. However, you never said anything about contexts, and isn't this important to understand how to make progress? So where do these different examples, how are they contextualized?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I've also got a note here from the previous question about able to change and thinking with engineers. And I think those two things might be able to be woven together. So one of the papers is trying to kind of more explicitly tackle the extent to which context shapes how willing people are to sort of buy into what you might call a modest way of thinking. It's, as you might imagine, it's not the kind of thing, I'm not a physical, like a quantitative scientist, and you could imagine doing a survey to try to correlate that. Somebody else wants to do it, great, happy to help. But I do much more, I find the qualitative conversations where I find gaps. So I could imagine you doing a survey that said, let's test how much people believe in modernity and how many off-grid toilets there are. I haven't done that. Instead, what we've done is try to use these many different contexts and think about their different histories with this idea of modernity. And so we actually tried to do a comparative analysis, and it didn't go over well. Because there's just too many factors and too big of a story to try to sell. But I do think there's probably a gem of accuracy there, in the sense that, so Zimbabwe, for example, one of the students I worked with was from there and did some work there. Zim was awfully close to some versions of modernist in the 80s. And I suspect that history shapes people's deep and profound sadness and a much less willingness, despite all the really, really bad infrastructure that's there now. They still have a mental picture of a 1980s working taps and flushing toilets that is hard to let go of. Whereas most of the people that we talked to in Kampala the place they know to use a flush toilet is like for someone else, right? Maybe they clean a house where there is one, but even then, sometimes they're not allowed to use the flushing toilet. They just clean the flushing toilet. So I think that context matters in many ways. One of the ways it matters is how people have kind of dwelt amidst a story of modernity in their upbringing shapes their willingness to think about things like this, or whether or not they really think it's a political reason we don't have modernity rather than a sort of ecological reason that we don't have modernity. Or additionally, that modernity is actually socially problematic. It's based on these really problematic assumptions about homogeneous people and knowing and controlling each other. And I always struggle with saying this, but I also feel like it's important to name. There's definitely in the rooms that I have pitched some of these ideas to, a demographic trend that is not one-to-one. People from the Global South in general, not to overgeneralize, tend to be more interested in the possibility of a non-modern future. People of color tend to be more interested in a non-modern future. Women tend to be more willing to see, believe, argue that modernity has problems. Again, forgive me for the people who may fit these criteria. It's usually older white men from the global north who believe in modernity still and want to stomp their feet and say, if we just had the right lefty movement, we could do it. Matt Huber's not much older than me, but I put him in that camp of people who grew up with a certain amount of privilege that means that they have a harder time letting go of the possibility of that for everyone, but also don't look as hard at the really bad things done under the name of modernity. And I would argue the impossibility of separating that from the really foundational concepts that modernity was built on, which is we're all the same and we can control it if we just get the science right. And if you believe that, then it's really hard to let go of flush toilets for everyone. But if you've experienced the bad end of that, it's not as hard to let go of. And it's, I think, more compelling to say, modest enough might be good enough and is way better than what I've been experiencing. Okay, maybe we'll try something different because this current pathway is not helping people like me. It's helping people like those people. And again, forgive but I do think to contextualize the imaginary in terms of countries, but people's experience of it helps us to understand each other and our allies, but to not overgeneralize because you're an old white man, you must be a modernist. No, that's really not what I'm trying to say. But I do think it matters for us to understand each other and how our experiences shape what we're willing to believe and what politics we're willing to advocate for.
Thank you for this really nice reflection there. We have also one question from Linus. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mary. Linus, working with Timos here at Temat, and thank you for the presentation. And also, we're trying to use this framework in our analysis, so it's very helpful. But there is something that I was thinking about. When you talked about theory in the beginning, you were saying that all theories, they're not just explaining or describing something, they're also having a normative aspect of them where they're pointing towards. And even though I think modesty and this framework is quite useful analytically, I'm wondering a bit where this normative aspect, what it is. What is the normative core in this? Because it is a bit of an emic theory where we're like looking at the complexity and the heterogeneity, and we want to raise that importance. But and maybe that goes back to Marcus' question about what kind of political direction does this give us? So I'm curious about that.
It's a great question and a hard question, and I'll give you a tentative answer and hopefully a thing that for us to continue thinking about. I would agree that how I presented is yeah, this is my synthesis of what other people told me more than my effort to advocate for the world I believe in. But let's be honest, right? Part of why I talked to those people was because I felt some resonance that the things that I was kind of trying to make sense of were things they were trying to make sense of. If I was going to try to sort of name some of those normative things for me, it is absolutely a diversity can become an oversimple word, but I still hold on to it as a useful one, right? That what the good life is for me to decide, not for you to tell me what it is. And so my kind of normative political starting point is absolutely one that is opposed to both the Arcadian uniformity, where there's a collective decision about what good lives are. And so there is some sort of, you could call them anarchist or libertarian, different lineages, much of the same arguments there around the importance of kind of autonomy. But what we write about in the book is that it's so important and totally lost in libertarian and anarchist thought is that none of us are ever fully autonomous, nor should we want to be. And so this is where, again, it's not a middle ground. It's an intellectual position that says we want freedom within our relationships, but we're dependent on our relationships, not just with other people, but with the world, in a way that so much of political theory ignores. And so there's some really great, again, happy to send links. There's a book that is, I'm going to forget the title of it, but it's such a good job of saying political theory doesn't think about the environment, but if it did, we would have all these asterisks next to our core political thought. Property is based on the idea that it's infinite, not material. Free markets are based on the idea that there's no such thing as an externality, right? You can go through all the ways in which getting off board a little bit, but to say, for me, the normative politics is one around recognizing that centering some freedom amidst relations. And so that makes me a weird lefty, because most global north lefties want more collective control. This is a vision and a version that is less collective than a conventional left. And I would say for me, that is part of where I come from, both as a person, but as a person doing work in contexts where the collective has often been really bad. And so the physical infrastructures that I find compelling are the ones that are more work, but more control over your work. And so that's sort of how it plays out for me in the kind of wider politics around cash transfers, which is a third talk, but I think has that same normative agenda behind it, which is full autonomy isn't the good idea in a world that's radically unequal. Use the state not to give it more power, but to redistribute. Definitely an equity, not equality. And now I think I'm repeating myself, but it's really, really big questions. And I think that teasing that out is part of seeing where those alliances are, but also why the Matt Hubers are just not interested, right? Because for them, the sort of collective power is the answer, not the problem.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this reflection. And as the time is soon closing for this lecture, if you have any last reflections, you can let us know. But I think there was actually one from Harold here. Yeah.
Thanks. Only a quick question was on the modesty thing. As you presented it, it was more that kind of the modesty is a quality of these infrastructure configurations you look at. But couldn't the modesty also lie in the analytical gaze? So to say, I was just thinking of Jasanoff and technologies of humility and so couldn't one also say that this modern infrastructure ideal is an analytical construct which tries to universalize, so that kind of so kind of a different type of modesty also in how we actually talk about these infrastructures and how we analyze them. Is this something which kind of resonates with each other, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's modesty all the way down and all the way through. Where we refer to modest infrastructure, but also a modest imaginary, modest approach to science, and I think for me, some of my own discomfort is not just performative. It is trying to make sure that I reiterate to you guys as well, right? Like, the agenda here is not to stomp confidently about the answer, but to try to embody that. And it does mean that maybe you don't fill a room full of thousands of people, because it's a harder thing to think about. And I do think that that's part of our like unfortunateness of our Twitterverse and all of, right, where the one sentence answer that is you're great, you're bad, capitalism is bad, socialism is bad, this is bad, this is right, like that sort of discourse sucks up all the oxygen in the room. The actual very first time we wrote about any of these ideas was a response to Paul Robbins trying to create a more polite conversation between some angry Twitterers who are the eco-socialists yelling at the degrowthers. And we went, look, you guys are both extremists, and most of us, again, I said this more politely, but like most of us don't agree with either of you, but everyone pays attention to those people. And I don't want anyone to pay attention to me. Like, the least comfortable part of my job is that you go around asking people to read stuff you do. Wish that wasn't part of the gig, right? I love the ideas. I don't love the selling of the ideas. But I do think that at least we need to keep pushing for space for more complicated ideas that are not trumpeted, but are places where we sit together and slowly think about it and say, let's work together to think about where this could go, not create these kind of hero cults of quick and easy answers. It's harder politics, but I don't think I could do it another way, and I don't believe in the other way, and so I try to modesty all the way down, failing at it sometimes.
I don't know if you're considering a political career by now, but
As I trash happens. Yeah.
I just want to take one last reflection. I thought, because you framed this a lot, and I mean, it's very true that it sort of emerged as a within sort of discussions of political ecology, but I think a sort of interesting academic issue that comes up from these concepts is also how they travel in other debates. So, for instance, people are using Higgs in transition studies or on other debates. And I think that is kind of like an interesting sort of, should I say spin-off? Or, and I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about these sort of slightly porous sort of boundaries between these fields, sort of like transitions and STS and sort of political ecology and so forth, and how some of these concepts might be actually traveling further than one might expect. Yeah.
Good preface for the talk that's coming tomorrow online, which you should feel free to ask for details. That's actually true. So the prompt for tomorrow is to think about political ecology and transitions, and there's an online thing. Certainly the modest part came from our interactions with political ecology. The Higgs part came before that, and I did think of those as almost separate tracks. I think some of that's just sort of people's weird personal biographies, and you go, wow, these things that I thought were different are not that different. I would say I think that maybe to build on what you were saying is connect back to your previous comment. What has been surprising to me maybe is that I think a lot of what we're saying actually resonates with engineers and physical scientists in a way that maybe they didn't expect it to either. And so your question around, are engineers able to change? My own sense, and part of where I get some of this optimism is, I think, as we've talked about before, engineers also know that the modern doesn't work very well. Most of them. But without a vocabulary for something else, it's really hard to complain. It's really hard to analyze. It's really hard to talk about. And so you end up with, well, these sewers don't work the way they're supposed to, but that's what my job is. And I don't know what else to do, so I'm going to keep doing it. And I don't know, I think many of us, kind of goes back to what we were saying before. I'm like, I think there's a lot of people who would love to be not professional engineers, but tinker some and enjoy that kind of work and enjoy that kind of stuff. And that many of the engineers who are interested in these alternative kinds of toilets are the ones who understand that things don't always go the way that you expect them to, and trying to do them differently. And so I part of what I've been trying to figure out is how do you do a version of this that is for engineers, or maybe not engineers, but non-social science, right? And we're sort of bridging that direction to say, how much of this do you need to know to be able to sort of do the tech, like be the design side of things? I don't know how much you need. And there's still a distinct role for social science to analyze it and show the connections, and especially to connect the technology to the politics and to the what kind of good state. Because I think part of what is compelling about this imaginary, right, to reiterate from a minute ago, it's modesty all the way down, but it's also modesty laterally too, right? To say we need modest infrastructure also means we need modest governance, also means we need a modest economy, also means, and when you scale it, that's not quite the right word, but when you can see it in all of its different facets, then it really has something really different to offer. When you're just like, it's just a different toilet and this toilet doesn't fit the modern world, you're like that doesn't fit. But when you start to put it into this bigger picture of all the other pieces, that's why we had to do it as a book, because we were like, can't do that in 8,000 words. At least for me, I'm like, I sleep better at night. Not because the answer is there, but because I feel like I know the direction of travel that I think makes sense. And so I think that part of what is interesting for me is actually, I think these ideas travel cross disciplines and that we found resonance in every discipline we went looking in, that there were some people with their own words. Their words were always focused on the piece, not the imaginary. And so we were able to kind of draw from and resonate with not just infrastructure, not just political ecology, but as far out as we've traveled, and say, I think we need to be able to recognize each other and recognize how much there is here, and then tell a political story, and then convince people that this political story is not the gold standard, but the best bet we have. And that's where I've been thinking for the last 2 years.
Thank you very much. And I think that we are now at the end of this fantastic lecture. Thank you so much for coming over here to Temate to talk to us about the world beyond modernity and the role of infrastructure. And thank you all for listening here in the room, but also online. For those in the room, there'll be some light snacks outside. All right, take care.
And thanks for the questions. Really, it's how we advance it.
Thank you.